Percy Jackson and Annabeth Chase are a couple from the Riordan verse. In my previous video, I went through their relationship, how it started, and how it evolved throughout the first 5 books of PJO. Today, I'll be continuing that video, and we'll go to the events of the Heroes of Olympus, the Trials of Apollo, and the most recent PJO book of the Chalice of Gods. I'll be talking about events in a lot of books, so there will obviously be spoilers following this. With that, let's get started. In my previous video, we left Percy and Annabeth starting their life together in The Last Olympian. Percy and Annabeth continued dating for a couple of months, and everything seems to be good until it wasn't. So let me explain. The Last Olympian actually left us with quite a cliffhanger, as Rachel there becomes the new host of the Oracle of Delphi, or the being that gives us prophecies from the god Apollo. Almost immediately after she was blessed as the new host, Rachel announced a prophecy. It talked about 7 haplets who were destined to defeat the Earth goddess Gaia. Percy and Annabeth didn't think so much about this prophecy because the great prophecy that had just happened in The Last Olympian was announced decades ago, and it took a while before it actually happened. So it left with everyone thinking that this prophecy of 7 was no big deal in the near future. Little did they know though that this was not the case. Hera, the queen of the gods, decided to step up and do something about this prophecy. She tried to find the demigods who would be part of the 7 demigods from the prophecy, and one of them ended up being Percy himself. Hera kidnapped Percy in the middle of the night and placed him in the Wolf House, a training ground for Roman demigods. Before we head further, I also have to introduce the Roman camp called Camp Jupiter. Camp Jupiter was basically Camp Haplid, but for Roman demigods. The Greek and Roman demigods were at war before, and to defeat Gaia, Hera knew that these 2 camps had to come together and sort out their differences. Because of this, she placed Percy in the Wolf House so that Percy would eventually go to Camp Jupiter and introduce Greek demigods to the Roman camp. Similarly, Hera kidnapped a Roman demigod son of Jupiter named Jason Grace. Jason was placed in a wilderness school with the Greek demigods Piper McLean and Leo Valdez. Through this, Hera placed a Roman demigod, aka Jason, with Greek demigods. This would alert the 2 camps of each other's existence, and they could finally come together to fight against Gaia. All of these events, however, were not known by anybody during this time. When Percy was kidnapped by Hera, Annabeth was devastated. She tried to search for him all over the country, and even asked Grover and Thalia to help her out, but it was no use. Percy was nowhere to be seen, and Annabeth was worried sick over him. With all this in mind, let's go to the first book of the Heroes of Olympus, The Lost Hero. Percy does not appear in this book, but what we do know is that Annabeth was still trying to find him. Annabeth was given a vision by Hera that she would find Percy from a guy with a lost shoe in the Grand Canyon. Annabeth goes there in The Lost Hero, and she realizes that the guy with the lost shoe was Jason Grace. However, there was a huge problem. Hera had tampered with Jason's brain and made him clueless about himself or his memories. He knew nothing, so when Annabeth asked Jason where Percy was, Jason couldn't answer that. Annabeth was too busy trying to find Percy in this book, so there's not really that much mention of either Percy or Annabeth. So now, let's go to the Son of Neptune. Here, we finally meet Percy. We see Percy being chased by Gorgons in the first chapter, and we realize that he also doesn't have his memories because of Hera tampering with his brain. The only thing he can remember, however, is Annabeth. He had extremely blurry memories, but he remembered spending time with her and how much he loved her. This is a sweet moment, as even the Queen of the Gods could not make Percy forget Annabeth. Yeah, just a bit of a trivia, like really random, but Percy and Annabeth were actually based on the author Rick Riordan's relationship with his wife Becky. Like, they're pretty much the real-life Percy and Annabeth, that Rick even placed Becky's name in the dedication of the Son of Neptune. There he had said, "To Becky, who shares my sanctuary in New Rome, even Hera could never make me forget you." Like, that's just a really random fact, but I thought it was a nice idea to add here. Anyway, we don't really get that many Percabeth moments in the Son of Neptune, aside from Percy's memories of spending time with Annabeth. It's clear that they still love each other so much, but they were separated by a great distance, as Percy was in Camp Jupiter and Annabeth was in Camp Haplid. They finally meet together in the Mark of Athena. The Greek demigods and Jason are aboard the Argo II, and they arrive in Camp Jupiter. There, Percy and Annabeth finally met after months of separation. Just moments after they saw each other, they ran to each other and shared a kiss. This was a sweet moment, and a hilarious scene happens after this. Annabeth judo flips Percy after remembering how much frustration and anger she felt because of his disappearance. The Romans around them were shook, but Percy just laughed it off and got up. Throughout the book, the two of them reconnected, and it was clear that they loved each other so much, despite being separated for months. One night, the two decided to bond together, and they ended up falling asleep in each other's arms. Percy and Annabeth woke up the next day to find Frank Zhang trying to find them for hours, and Frank was embarrassed to walk in the two of them. A couple of events happen in this book before the main highlight happens. Annabeth has a quest in the Mark of Athena to get the Athena Parthenos. To get to it, Annabeth had to face her biggest fear, who was Arachne, the mother of spiders. Annabeth manages to trick Arachne into a trap, and the unsteady flooring of the cave suddenly starts to give way. The Argo too came in to rescue Annabeth, and the seven tried bringing the Athena Parthenos with them. Annabeth's leg was suddenly pulled down into a gaping hole in the floor, and Percy ran after her. This leads up to Percy holding on to a small ledge to keep Annabeth from falling into the cliff. And seeing the situation, Annabeth tells Percy to let go, as it was useless to save her. Percy disagreed, and it was decided that the seven and Nico and Angelo were to meet Percy and Annabeth on the other side of Epirus. With that, Percy let go of the ledge, and they fell down into the depths of Tartarus, or essentially hell in Greek mythology. With this, let's go to the House of Hades. A lot of things happen here in this book, so you gotta bear with me here. I mean, the House of Hades is one of the longest books in the Riordan verse for a reason, and it contains vital moments in Percy and Annabeth's relationship. So, let's get into it. From the moment Percy and Annabeth fell into that cliff, it took them at least 9 days to finally reach Tartarus below them. When they're nearing the ground, they see a river below, and to cushion their fall, Percy controls the water to catch them. This ended up as a good and bad idea, because on the good side, they managed to survive the sudden crash into Tartarus. But on the bad side, the river they landed in was the river Cocytus. The river Cocytus was also called the river of lamentation or wailing, as was filled with heartbroken voices that attacked people with feelings of grief. Percy was incredibly affected by this, to the point that he wanted to drown himself in the river and give up. Annabeth snaps him out of it though, and tries to get his attention away from the river by talking about New Rome and their future together. This managed to get Percy's attention, and they get out of the water. To get more of their strength, Percy and Annabeth come across the river Phlegeton, and this helps them make it through the journey. They continue their quest to get out of Tartarus, and they came across a titan named Bob or Iapetus. In the side book, The Sword of Hades, Iapetus and Percy meet, and Percy ends up erasing Iapetus' memories by accident. This because Percy used the river Lethe or the river of forgetfulness to attack Iapetus, and now Iapetus knew nothing about himself. Instead, he took the name Bob and owned a cat. Bob, Percy, and Annabeth travel together, and they encounter obstacles until they came across creatures called Arai. The Arai tell Bob about how Percy had erased Bob's memories before, and Bob gets hurt. Bob refuses to help Percy and Annabeth out of shock and betrayal, and Percy and Annabeth are forced to fight the Arai off. This ended up as a big mistake though. Percy and Annabeth soon realized that the Arai were creatures of curses. When you tried to attack one of them, you'd be attacked by an act you did in the past. This is evident when Percy attacked the Arai and he got stabbed on both sides, just like what he did to the giant Gurion in the Battle of the Labyrinth. The two panic on how to defeat the Arai, but they have no choice but to fight back. Annabeth attacks one of them, and she suddenly goes blind as she gets attacked by a curse. This blindness was related to what Annabeth did in the Sea of Monsters. There, Annabeth had pretended to be nobody against the Cyclops Polyphemus, and this trick now gave her blindness. Annabeth was attacked by the Arai once more, and Annabeth, blind yet alert, managed to kill it. This again had a side effect. The Arai cursed Annabeth into thinking that Percy had left her. This was a shocking curse to Percy and to many readers like me, because it turns out that this curse came from Calypso. Calypso and Percy met in the Battle of the Labyrinth, and she was trapped in her island Ogygia. She was fated to fall in love with every man who came to her island, but they would always leave her and break her heart. Percy was one of them. Calypso fell in love with Percy, but Percy eventually had to leave her. With this realization, Percy tried to run to Annabeth to give her a sign that he was still there, but it was no use. The Aryan surrounded her, and Percy decided that if he was going to be cursed, he might as well kill all the Aryan himself to get them away from Annabeth. Percy attacked the Aryan, suffering curse after curse until he was hit by a powerful one. It was something he did to Phineas, the blind seer he met in the Son of Neptune. Percy had tricked Phineas into drinking poisonous Gorgon's blood, and Phineas literally disintegrated. Like, for a Percy Jackson book, that was actually pretty dark. Actually, the House of Hades itself is the darkest book in the Heroes of Olympus, so moments like these are pretty common. But anyway, Percy starts suffering from the disintegration that Phineas experienced before, and he begs Bob to help them. He thinks it's hopeless, but he continues and tells Bob to protect Annabeth. Percy then decides that if he is going to die, he'll go down fighting before the Aryan attack Annabeth further. Percy is about to do this, but the Aryan suddenly disintegrates into dust. Bob saves them and brings them over to the giant Damison. Damison heals Percy and Annabeth. The group talks about the situation, and it turns out that to get out of Tartarus was through the Doors of Death elevator. This elevator would lead them to the world of the living, but guarding it were a bunch of monsters. To disguise Percy and Annabeth, they had to be covered in death mist, and the only way to get that was through the goddess of misery, Achilles. This mist made them look like corpses, which is exactly what they needed as a disguise. One of the most infamous scenes of the Riordan verse happens after this. Percy and Annabeth go and meet Achilles, but Achilles ended up tricking them. She tries to kill them, and Percy and Annabeth fight back to defend each other. At one point, Achilles managed to open some plants of poison, and seeing it all around him, Percy concentrated and controlled the poison. He was able to do this because of his water abilities, and he became so powerful. Achilles lost control of her own poison, and Percy choked her with it, showing a darker take on who Percy was. Annabeth begs Percy to stop, and Percy only does this because she told him so. Annabeth was terrified of Percy's new power, and she told him to never use it again because some things were not meant to be controlled. The two of them then encountered the goddess of night Nyx, and after tricking Nyx with her children, Percy and Annabeth ran out of there. Percy then saved Annabeth from nearly jumping into a cliff. On this cliff was the river Acheron, and it was the river of pain. It showed the faces of the dead from PJO, and Percy and Annabeth consoled each other on the memories of the previous series. They then managed to jump over the cliff to the other side, and they met Bob and Damison. The group eventually has a face-off with Tartarus himself, and they try to go to the Doors of Death to finally get out of Tartarus. Annabeth runs over and tries to open the door as Percy fights monster after monster. Percy tells Annabeth to go up already without him, but Annabeth refuses, saying she can't leave him again. It turns out that someone had to be holding the elevator for 12 minutes on the other side to complete the ride up, and Bob volunteered to do it for them. Percy and Annabeth protested against this, but Bob was willing to do it. He told Percy to say hello to the sun and stars for him in the world of the living, and Bob sacrificed himself for Percy and Annabeth. Percy and Annabeth made it out of Tartarus, but lost Bob in the process. At the end of the book, Percy fulfills his promise to Bob by looking up at the night sky with Annabeth and saying, "Bob says hello." And now let's go to the Blood of Olympus. Here, Percy and Annabeth's romance is sort of thrown to the side as Rick becomes more plot-oriented instead. The book shows the Seven trying to head to Athens for the final battle against Gaia, but before the actual fight, Percy and Annabeth get a sweet moment in Athens. Athens was the place where the Athena and Poseidon rivalry started, and realizing this, Percy kissed Annabeth and told her that the rivalry ended there and that he loved her. This was a sweet moment, as for centuries, Poseidon and Athena were known enemies, and when Percy, a son of Poseidon, and Annabeth, a daughter of Athena, got together, it changed everything. Percy and Annabeth fought together against the giants in the final battle, and at one point, both of them were wounded. Their blood spilled on the ground, and Gaia woke up. Once more, Percy and Annabeth fought in Camp Haplet in the final battle against Gaia. Leo Valdez ends up sacrificing himself, and in one big explosion, Gaia was defeated. Annabeth and Percy mourn Leo's death, and Reyna Ramirez-Arellano, the praetor of Camp Jupiter, comes over to them. Reyna offers the two of them to go to New Rome for college, and Percy and Annabeth accepted. This brings us to the new timeline of the Riordan verse due to the addition of the Chalice of Gods. Chronologically, after the Blood of Olympus would be the Trials of Apollo's first book, or the Hidden Oracle. But somehow, Rick decided to squeeze in the Chalice of Gods in between the Blood of Olympus and the Hidden Oracle. We also learned that the Chalice of Gods will be a new trilogy, with the Chalice of Gods just being the first book. The second book after it is called The Wrath of the Triple Goddess, which will come out this September 24, and a third book will come out after that. So far, we don't have that much plot information on The Wrath of the Triple Goddess and the third book, so we'll just have to make do with what we have right now, and by going through this order. The Chalice of Gods, then the books chronologically in the Trials of Apollo, and then we get some Percabeth cameos in the Magnus Chase trilogy, until finally, I'll also give a shout out to the Percabeth cameo in The Sun and the Star. Percy and Annabeth appear a lot in the Chalice of Gods, and there's a lot of premise before we enter this book. Because they were pretty much non-school for the past 5 books thanks to the war against Gaia, Percy and Annabeth had to complete some years in high school before they actually get into college. Percy and Annabeth enrolled in different schools, and they often met up to hang out or do homework. They're now in their senior year of high school, and Percy finds out that he needs 3 recommendation letters from 3 gods to enter New Rome University with Annabeth. This because Percy is a forbidden child of the Big 3 from the Great Prophecy in PJO, and to prove that he's a worthy student, he has to get the recommendation letters. To get these letters, Percy needs to do quests for the gods once more. He tells us to Annabeth, and we learn in this book that Annabeth was actually taking a culinary class in her school. She helps cook some dinner with Percy's mom and stepdad, and she agrees to help Percy with the recommendation letters. Percy, Annabeth, and Grover meet up the next day in Himbo Juice, a smoothie shop, and that's when they meet Ganymede. Ganymede is a cupbearer of the gods, and he recently lost his chalice. In exchange for a recommendation letter, Percy should do the quest to retrieve Ganymede's lost chalice. The first suspect for the thief was the former cupbearer of the gods, Hebe. Hebe ran an arcade for boomers in a place called Heebie Jeebies, and Percy, Annabeth, and Grover go there. Hebe gets mad at them for thinking that she stole the chalice, and she turns them into 8-year-olds. Percy, Annabeth, and Grover then scramble around, and they try to reverse the curse. It ends with Annabeth tricking Hebe, and it finally worked. They return back into their normal selves. Hebe then told them that she didn't have the chalice, and that the goddess Iris might have it. They leave the place, and that night, Percy and Annabeth had an Iris message together to talk about what's been happening. They talked about how to contact Iris, and if there was a demigod from camp to make it easier. It turns out that Annabeth does have a contact, and it was a daughter of Iris named Blanche. They meet Blanche the next day, and they also meet Iris. To get more information on the chalice, Iris sends them on a mission instead, which is to clean her staff. Percy, Annabeth, and Grover find themselves in the River Ellison, a river that can clean anything, but it was covered in dirt after being used for centuries. When Percy cleans the staff with Annabeth and Grover, the god Ellison gets mad at Percy for making the river dirtier, and this leads to a confrontation. Ellison tries to drown Percy in the river, but Percy's powers kicked in and attacked Ellison instead. We then meet Annabeth having tea with Ellison, as Ellison looks traumatized by Percy's powers. Apparently, Percy's powers also cleaned the ocean, so now they needed to escape with the staff. There was a big problem though. Throughout this time, Grover was distracting horned serpents away from Annabeth, and Percy had to save Grover. Percy tried to distract the snakes, and as the snakes surrounded him, Percy thought to himself that he'd probably die at that moment. He thinks that he should talk to Annabeth one last time, but Iris' staff eventually saves him. Percy and Annabeth head to Iris and give the goddess her staff. Iris then gives them nectar, as this would lead them to the chalice. She also tells them that the thief was named Gary. After this, a couple more events happen in this book. Annabeth visits Percy in the Jackson Blofus home with cupcakes, and they hang out together. It also turns out that Sally Jackson, Percy's mom, was pregnant with a daughter named Estelle Blofus. This was the child she had with her new husband, Paul Blofus. Percy is delighted by the news, and he soon walks Annabeth to the subway station when Annabeth leaves for home. Annabeth reassures Percy that he'll be a great big brother to his new stepsister, remembering Annabeth's stepbrothers from her dad, Frederick Chase. Fast forward a couple of events, and we have the highlight of this book, the fight against Gary, or Geras, the god of old age. Geras and Percy have a fight, and Geras is a powerful opponent. Percy gets beaten up, and Annabeth tries to distract Geras a couple of times to help Percy, but Geras was not having it. Percy tries to figure out a way to fight the embodiment of old age, and the one thing that pulled him into winning was a memory. This memory was from his friend Jason Grace. In the Blood of Olympus, Jason had imagined a future with him and Piper. They would grow old together with grandchildren, and Percy remembered this. He thinks to himself that maybe old age isn't that bad because he wants the same future with Annabeth. He thought about this, and instead of fighting Garrus, Percy hugged him in a metaphorical sense of acceptance. He accepted old age because he wanted to have a future with Annabeth, which would also explain how much he wanted to get those recommendation letters to get into New Rome University. He wanted to spend his life with Annabeth, and this became the one thing that defeated Garrus. Garrus was so touched by this that he gave back the chalice, and the day was saved there. They give the chalice back to Ganymede, and Percy goes to Mount Olympus. On the mission, he accidentally makes eye contact with Annabeth's mother Athena, but Athena lets Percy go. Ganymede gives him the recommendation letter, and it's a blank page with enchanted paper. They have to place the right words to write in it, and Annabeth helps Percy do this. Later on, Percy talks about his trip to Olympus, and he mentions how Athena actually saw him earlier. Annabeth is surprised by this, but they both take it as a sign that Athena is finally accepting the truth that Percy and Annabeth were dating. Annabeth reminds Percy that they still needed 2 more recommendation letters, and they ended with a kiss. We don't know that much about the wrath of the triple goddess, so let's just skip ahead and go to what we know. Let's go to the trials of Apollo. Percy and Annabeth barely appear here, but there are a few mentions here and there. We meet Percy in the first Trials of Apollo book, or the Hidden Oracle, and Annabeth isn't with him. This because chronologically, Annabeth was with her cousin Magnus Chase in the Sword of Summer. That's all we ever get of them, and the next we ever get of them again is in the Tower of Nero. Percy and Annabeth are together in New Rome, and they just graduated high school. They meet the god Apollo, and it's revealed that Percy was struggling to choose a major in college. The conversation leads to the mention of Jason's death, and the 3 of them bond together, mourning their friend's death. And now, let's go to a cameo they get in the Magnus Chase trilogy. Percy and Annabeth are seen together in the last Magnus Chase book, or The Ship of the Dead. Percy and Annabeth help train Magnus Chase for his quest against the Norse god Loki. Percy and Annabeth bond as they realize that Percy's sword Riptide is actually a girl thanks to Magnus's talking sword Jack. Percy gives Magnus advice for Magnus's quest against Loki and tells them that majority of the time, quests are unpredictable and that sometimes planning and training might be pointless. Annabeth frowns at this because she's a war strategist who makes plans, but Percy goes on to compliment her. He tells Magnus that Annabeth is the strongest person he knows. She doesn't have any flashy powers like the rest of the demigods do, but because of her intelligence and wit, she's a powerful demigod on her own. Annabeth kissed Percy with that note, and they had to leave. The last Magnus ever saw Percy and Annabeth was Percy driving down the road in a Prius, singing a song horribly as Annabeth laughed at him. The last we ever get of Percy and Annabeth is in The Sun and the Star. Percy and Annabeth are studying for an English test when they get a call from Nico D'Angelo and Will Solus. They talk about Tartarus and what happened to Bob and Damison. Percy and Annabeth actually try to change the subject because it disturbed them to remember what happened there, but Nico and Will needed some advice. In the end, Percy and Annabeth told them that the best option was for Nico and Will to stick together, and that they could survive anything if they had each other. And that's all we know about Percy and Annabeth so far. Percy and Annabeth were a couple who started out as strangers to each other. They barely knew each other, and they had a bit of a bias against each other because their parents were enemies. However, they started to develop more from there, and they ended up loving each other so much. Throughout the books, their relationship faced many challenges, from the life-threatening adventures, but they stayed strong and loved each other through it all. This makes them one of the most loved couples in the Riordan verse, and in my opinion, one of the best. So, how about you? What do you think of Percabeth? Let me know in the comments down below.